Day 2 of AlterCOP30 Australia, Sustainable Cities. And it's so wonderful to have you all here. Did anyone join us yesterday? Show of hands? Woo! Okay, so you would have heard from our very passionate Audrey Verrucci, the CEO of People for Nature, who spoke powerfully about hope and stubborn optimism. We were invited to lean in and draw on the deep cultural knowledge of First Nations people by Gregory Andrews, who, not to put you all to shame, but he arrived by bicycle from Canberra. So throughout the day, Mandy Nolan, she guided us with her sharp, comedic emceeing, which amid all the humour, actually really grounded us in the realities and challenges of climate action. Now, across this conference, we will have over 1,500 to 1,800 people take part in AlterCOP events right across the country. And that's just such a powerful sign of how ready Australians are to engage in climate action at every level. So what exactly is AlterCOP? Well, AlterCOP is a climate movement for all. It was co-founded by the Matcha Institute and the Transmutation Principle, and that happened last year at AlterCOP29 in Singapore. The event brought together over 2,300 participants, 250 speakers, and more than 130 sessions, proving that meaningful, high-impact climate engagement can actually thrive outside traditional structures. So, building on that success, the AlterCOP Global Core team partnered with the beautiful People for Nature, who are an Australian charitable social enterprise that empowers citizen-led action for nature across Australia. Now, AlterCOP is a decentralised global climate event that is united by a common set of vision and values. Our 4-day agenda runs alongside the UN COP30 in Brazil, and the timing couldn't be better. As Australia prepares to host COP31, AlterCOP really gives us the chance to showcase the incredible local climate initiatives already happening in our cities. In fact, Audrey and I were talking about this just before. Yesterday really laid the foundations for what this week means. Today is all about action. So strap in, because I hope you're ready. Now, this event could not have been possible without the countless hours and energy, although it's definitely starting to wane for some of us, who volunteered to put this event together. Every one of the event team you meet today has absolutely 100% volunteered their time and energy to the climate cause, and we are eternally grateful for their support. So please take time to thank them when you see them today for putting this on. Now, as the founder and director of Impact Dragonfly, it is my great honour to be your MC for the day, and my work is all about assisting organisations turn sustainability strategy into meaningful action. I got the good day. So I am also very, very proud to serve as an ambassador for People for Nature. You would have seen me in a purple t-shirt yesterday. Our mission is to broaden climate participation, amplify community voices, and make environmental leadership accessible to everyone. So I'm going to be with you throughout the entire day, supported by the extraordinary team of volunteers. Now, our volunteers and supporters, now they hail from a thriving ecosystem of collaborators. And I don't think this is even all of them. But there's also our partners that have made events like this possible. And a particular shout out today to Mott MacDonald, who are our green sponsor for the day, and we are incredibly grateful for your support. Yesterday, we had the most incredible welcome to country, where Baringa not only welcomed us, but she enabled us to lean in and share her culture And actually, I feel quite emotional because just even thinking about how she made us feel at the time. But she really let us ground ourselves in the land, which we are all so passionate about protecting. Today's acknowledgement has been kindly provided to us by Arabelle Douglas, and I'm going to read her words as she wrote them. We acknowledge that AlterCOP30 takes place on the unceded lands and waters now called Australia. Country never ceded and still cared for by its First Peoples. We honour ancestors, elders, and the living systems that guide our responsibilities to Earth. We also want to pay our respects to the Indigenous peoples of the Amazon, the hosts of COP30, and to all First Nations and local communities protecting rivers, oceans, forests, and skies worldwide. May our work here embody reciprocity, respect, and renewal, and carried by the living systems that sustain us. It's beautiful. Now, throughout the day, we're also going to have a live Slido running, and you're very welcome to upload your comments, reflections, or anything that you would like to share that could add value to the audience. And we're going to be collating all those insights and contributing them afterwards in our impact report. Now, as I mentioned, we have a fantastic team of volunteers here today, so if you need anything, please reach out to them. But before we move into our first panel, I'd like to share our youth voice video to help set the scene. When we talk about sustainable cities, it would be remiss not to include the perspectives of young professionals, the very people who will inherit the outcomes of the decisions we make today. So a huge thank you to the United Nations Australia, the Young Professional Alliance, for partnering with us to make this possible. And you will see this thread woven throughout the day as youth voices remain a consistent and grounding part of our conversations.
Living in a sustainable city would feel like it being seamless.
One word for living in a sustainable city to me would be empowered, because living in a sustainable city is empowering. It means knowing that your everyday choices, how you move, what you use, how you connect, they all contribute to something bigger. And that's empowering. It's the feeling that you're part of a city that genuinely cares about its people and the planet. And that is definitely empowering.
In one word, what living in a sustainable city feels like? Hope.
One word for living in a sustainable city to me would be accessible, not just physically, but socioeconomically. So to me, I think a sustainable city is one which allows all people to have access to all the things that we previously mentioned, and doesn't favor or restrict anyone based on their personal circumstances that they were either born into or have fallen into. But seeing a society which enables people to thrive and empowers them to shape their lives in the way that they wish to live them.
Freedom. A livable city brings freedom to house, learn, live, work, and play within reach. It brings safety and sustainability so we can enjoy living here together. It brings freedom to live the life we want to live, where we want to live it. Freedom.
So the next session is Rethinking, Transport for Equity and Emissions. Now, you might be wondering why these two themes are sitting side by side. At first, equity and emissions can actually feel like opposing forces. A transport solution that improves access for communities may not always deliver the lowest carbon footprint. And the most emissions efficient options aren't always the most socially inclusive. So this conversation invites us to sit in that tension, because truly sustainable cities require both. Transport systems that reduce emissions and ensure people, all people, can move safely, affordably, and with dignity. So today's panel will explore what this balance looks like across Australia. How do we decarbonise transport while ensuring no community is left behind? What trade-offs do we need to acknowledge? And where are the opportunities to design mobility systems that are both fair and future ready? It's a really big question, and I'm glad it's not me answering it, it's you guys. Before we hear from our panellists, we're just going to ground this conversation in the voices of those who will live longest with the transport systems we designed today. So again, I went to the young professionals and we asked them, what does sustainable transport look like to you?
Equitable and sustainable transport looks like a city where everyone can easily and conveniently get around using public transport or bicycles without being forced to rely on a car. When cities are built this way, people aren't burdened by the high costs and maintenance of owning a vehicle. This matters because making cars a necessity can place financial strain on people, especially those with lower incomes, and can even lead to unsafe vehicles on the road due to affordability issues. Accessible transport helps improve safety, quality of life, and equality.
Equitable and sustainable transport for me, equitable and sustainable transport means giving everyone the freedom to move around the city safely and affordably without harming the planet. It's having more reliable public transport, more bike paths, and spaces where walking really feels safe and enjoyable. When transport works for everyone, not just those who can afford a car, it helps people connect, reduce emissions, and makes the city just a better place to live.
In terms of equitable and sustainable transport, equitable and sustainable transport means to me currently what Brisbane Transport is, which is the affordable 50-cent fares, but elevating this so that it's easy to get around the city. As I find it's really easy to get into the city, but it's not so easy to get to the suburbs or to go east and west. It seems like the bus routes kind of all take you towards the city where you then have to transfer. And, you know, that can turn your commute, instead of it being a 10-minute drive, it turns it into a 40-minute transport on public transport. But I do love the 50-cent fares that Brisbane has and has had for a few years now. It means that we can go to the Gold Coast from Brisbane, be on multiple different buses, trains, trams, and because it's all considered one route, it's only 50 cents. And I think this is a really affordable option for everyone. And I look forward to, I suppose, other ideas that governments can come up with in terms of making transport even more accessible and sustainable in terms of how people are moving, how to move people, you know, for big events like the Olympics, and how these can shape the way that Queensland's transport evolves to cater for mass population and mass tourism.
Equitable transport to me is about giving opportunities to everyone to be able to access the various areas of the city affordably and with ease. I think one of the shortcomings of our public transport system at the moment is that it can take a long time to get connected into public transport, but that this is a challenge that we're actively making efforts to fix. Especially now with things such as bike paths and methods that are alternative to driving being taken up much more frequently now. I think as the city starts to condense, we're really starting to see greater accessibility for all people. It's really important to me in particular that the youth have access to things such as educational institutions, parks, being able to get to sporting activities or other extracurricular activities in order to find positive ways to interact with each other and build that sense of community in ways that aren't restricted by public transport. I think that's what equitable transport to me really is about.
Sustainable transport to me means freedom. The freedom to safely move to a city. The freedom to find work, education and pleasure within reach. To that end, transport must be affordable and accessible. Accessible for all abilities, but also with regular times and regular locations. That's something we struggle a lot with in our area. Moreover, it must be multimodal, so you can switch easily and conveniently between different modes of transport. For example, if I want to commute from the Sunshine Coast to Brisbane, it takes me an hour and a half by car. But imagine if I would do the same by train. I have to drive to a station at least half an hour away and then be 2 to 3 hours on the train, one way only. Imagine, even though I care a lot about the planet, is that really convenient and accessible? Think again.
So their answers really remind us that the future of mobility isn't just about infrastructure, technology or emissions. It's actually about understanding the lived experiences of the next generation. So it's time to invite our moderator up for the next session, and I am very pleased to welcome Eamon Fenwick, Head of Sustainability APAC for SAP, to the stage. Eamon leads SAP's sustainability team across Asia Pacific, working with customers to drive their sustainability goals and initiatives through SAP technology across industry sectors spanning from utilities to automotive. With over 15 years in management consulting and technology advisory, he advises customer executives from C-suite IT operations and finance experts through to sustainability leaders on evolving ESG topics from a strategy, value, and technical perspective. Please make Eamon welcome.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Sarah, and thank you also very much for all of you being here today, but also the whole AlterCOP team, People for Nature, Impact Dragonfly, and Mott MacDonald as well for supporting this event. As Sarah mentioned, my name's Eamon Fenwick. I'm working across Asia Pacific with some of the Japanese automotive companies, logistics providers in India on this topic, but I'm very much looking forward to hearing the insights from this panel today around sort of the Australian perspective on this topic of emissions and equity and really rethinking transport and sustainable cities. So to get cracking on this panel, I'd like to invite up firstly Todd Hacking, who holds double degree in politics and law from the University of Adelaide and is a graduate of the AICD. He has forged a successful career advocating public policy solutions for a range of industries, including infrastructure, transport, land use planning, environment safety, construction, manufacturing, and logistics. He's the CEO of Heavy Vehicle Industry Australia, where he advocates for truck, trailer, component, equipment, and technology manufacturers and suppliers, as well as organising the largest B2B event in Queensland, the Brisbane Truck Show. Thanks, Todd. Next, Santiago Velasquez is a Churchill Fellow, UN panellist, TEDx speaker, and the founder and CEO of iSight and Halo. These are two accessibility-focused tech ventures reshaping how people with disability navigate the world. A vision-impaired engineer and entrepreneur, Santi brings a powerful lived experience lens to innovation, inclusion, and systems change. He leads major accessibility projects supported by QUT, Vision Australia and Guide Dogs Australia, and is currently establishing a not-for-profit to improve access to disability aids in Colombia. As the first visually impaired person to study electrical engineering in the Southern Hemisphere, and a mentor and judge for global innovation programs, Santi is recognised internationally for advancing inclusive design and human-centred technology. Thanks for being here today, Santi. Catherine Benny is a chartered civil engineer with Mott MacDonald and RPEQ with over 15 years of experience in city shaping infrastructure, transport planning and precinct development. She is a recognised leader in delivering safe, connected and multimodal transport solutions that prioritise people and encourage sustainable travel. Catherine brings expertise in active transport and public transport planning, traffic engineering and road safety. Her work spans projects across Queensland, including the Kangaroo Point Green Bridge, Central Queensland Bus Network Access Study, and major public transport infrastructure projects such as the Wave and Brisbane Metro. Catherine is passionate about creating transport networks that enable sustainable mobility choices for communities of all ages and abilities. So fantastic. So to jump right into the panel sessions, and as Sarah said, equity and emissions together with transport. Some might think opposing views, but really, Todd, first up, if I could ask, sort of just your first impressions, first perspectives on the topic.
Thanks, Eamon, and thanks everyone for coming, and great to be here with you all. When Sarah first asked me, I said, "Are you sure you want the truck guy at AlterCOP?" No, that seems a bit strange. But we talked it through, and it led me to some challenging thoughts about how we can all share that road network safely. And so for me, I was looking at some of the statistics around the freight numbers, and that's just continuing to increase in Australia. So, the road freight task at the moment is about 250 billion tonne kilometres. We're rising to 400 billion tonne kilometres by 2050. So it's a 77% increase in road freight. And there's whole reasons for that. I won't go into it. Who here's bought anything online in the last 2 weeks? Hands up, maybe. Some people don't want to admit that they have. But that's one of the reasons why this increasing road freight task. And so when I look at things like equity, it's about how do we share that road space, because those roads can't get wider and bigger, and trucks have to share the roads with cars, with school drop-off, with people going to work, students going to university, cyclists, walkers, runners. So how do we do that? I guess is a really important task, and then how do we do it in terms of with a lower emissions footprint? And that's a really interesting time for my industry at the moment, because look, right now you can go and buy a 100% tailpipe free of emissions truck tomorrow. That's not the problem. The problem is that at the moment it's very expensive to do that, and businesses can't necessarily afford to do that en masse. And so just to maybe give you an example of where I think we're at in the time cycle or the adoption curve, I think we're right at the very beginning of when maybe, for those of you old enough in the room, maybe we're at Nokia going to iPhone first generation, right? So, it's starting to be talked about, but now we're at iPhone 17, I think. So we're a long way away from, and the other example I had was the television. I remember, I'm still old enough that we had one TV in the living room. It was an old square box with no remote control. You had to walk up to the TV and change the channels. And then flat screen TVs came out, and everyone wanted one, but they were 20 grand, and no one could afford them in the mainstream. But now I go to my friends' houses and there's 4 flat screen TVs in each bedroom, and so which is a really interesting question when you come back to that equity equation, because it's consumerism which is driving this demand for freight. I don't think in terms of doing it at emissions isn't, or getting a truck isn't the problem. It's about trying to do that in a sustainable way. And that's not to say the industry is doing nothing. For those of you who are interested, we're now at Euro 6, which is mandated in Australia as of the 1st of November this year. So every new truck that goes on the road has to have a Euro 6 engine in it. And just to give you some understanding of why that's important, the difference between a Euro 5 engine and a Euro 6 engine, a Euro 6 engine, so that's just one version before. So Euro 1 was introduced in the 90s, early 90s. We've had 6 iterations over 35 years. Euro 5 to Euro 6 was a 70% improvement in NOx gases. And so when you talk about equity, one of the things that I also think about in terms of equity is social cohesion and health. Anyone suffer from asthma here? NOxes, really bad for the environment, really bad for people who suffer from asthma. And so if we can get those NOx gases out of the environment, if we can reduce those emissions out of the environment through whether it is a new truck or whether it is just a better performing truck, a higher productivity truck, then we're going to be able to do that with that increasing freight task. So that's my initial thoughts, Eamon.
Fantastic. Catherine.
Yeah, thank you. So I've been fortunate working in the transport industry that I've been able to work on major transport infrastructure projects, but more recently in that space of planning and designing for people walking and riding and using public transport. And when we look at transport emissions, it's really important to understand how big that task is going to be to reduce that. The road transport accounts for about 80% of all transport emissions in Australia. And of that 80%, 60% of that is because of passenger vehicles, so private vehicle use, light commercial vehicles, motorcycles, everyone in their cars. So it's a big task, it's a big challenge, and one of the frameworks that we can look at to try and tackle that is avoid, shift and improve. So avoid is, do we actually need to travel? Are there other options that we can travel, that remove the need to travel on the network? And, digital and technology plays a huge part in that. And people can work from home more easily, how we create more jobs where people can work from home. Do we need, from a consulting perspective, do I need to hop in my car or the work car, go to that site, or can I just hop on aerial imagery? Do I need to fly over to the country town over yonder to have a face-to-face meeting, or can we just chat on a Zoom call? So avoiding that need to travel is the first step in reducing those emissions. The next one is shift. How do we shift from private car use to more sustainable modes of transport like walking and riding and public transport? And that's where I spend a lot of my time, and I'll probably focus on that today. And improve, we've already touched on with Todd there. How can we improve the vehicles that we are using so they're having less impact on the environment?
Wonderful. So that tech lens, which we'll go into in a little while as well. Fantastic. Thanks, Catherine. And Santiago.
This is a bit of an interesting question for me, because when I first started in the public transport space, I got in it because of the accessibility lens, right? I started my company because I was frustrated that I couldn't, well, I still can't, see a bus to hail it. So because I couldn't see it, the bus would leave me behind. And because of that, I rely on either taxis, Ubers, rideshare of some sort, more so than I think I should, right? I would love to use public transport more often because it's there, and if we look at the statistics, it's much more effective to pack 20, 30, 35 people inside a diesel bus than it is for everybody to drive a small little vehicle. Now you change that bus into an electric bus and we're talking, greater numbers of improvement. But in terms of where this intersection stood out between inclusiveness, accessibility, and equity and emissions for me was when the realization that the data to improve public transport in certain areas doesn't exist. What I mean by that is, if you have a disability in Australia, not all of them, but if you have a disability, oftentimes you don't have to pay for public transport. I.e. myself, I don't have to pay for public transport because I can't drive, so sort of the way of them saying, okay, well, you can't drive, so we'll give you this one. But the problem is, I don't have to tap my Go card, or my MyKey, or my Opal card, which means that the government doesn't actually know where I'm moving. So they don't know whether I'm going from Kangaroo Point to Fortitude Valley, or whether I'm doing a commute from the Gold Coast to Brisbane City. So they can't actively improve those services as much as they would like to. And in addition to that, there are a lot of components within the transport sector, right? So if you work as a manufacturer of vehicles, as a building company, as a consultant, you know all the ins and outs, but the general public doesn't. The general public doesn't know that the Brisbane City Council operates the buses, but they have nothing to do with the timetables, the bus stops, the TransLink cover. And they don't know that TransLink has nothing to do with operating the buses. So I bring all that up because when I started, as I said at the beginning, I thought, you know what, I'm going to improve public transport by looking at it from the perspective of my lived experience. How do we make sure that I don't have to use Ubers and taxis and basically spend money from taxi subsidies or NDIS that doesn't need to be spent, because if public transport was accessible, we could have more improvements in other areas. So I love this discussion because going back to what Todd said at the beginning, you know, for a lot of us, buying things online is a luxury. For myself, as somebody who's vision impaired, it's actually a preference, because online I can look at the specs of whatever I'm buying, I can compare, contrast, but if I go to a store, I have to ask somebody, and then if I want to ask a follow-up question and then a follow-up question, it becomes more daunting. And obviously they are very friendly, but at the same time they also need to sell. So if I take 40 minutes asking questions, that's not cool, man. So we get back into this perception of, yes, it sounds crazy that they are interconnected, but they very much are. If we can make public transport more accessible, more people will use it. If more people use public transport, and if more people walk, and if more people, they want to use it, then we can take emissions away, and we can start with the basics. And there are more complex things, but the technical aspect is being worked on, because we like challenges. It's everything else that comes after that that we need to sort of get our minds wrapped around.
Thanks, Santi, for sharing some of those insights and really setting the context for some of the other topics we'll cover. We've talked about online retail, online shopping a few times already in the last few minutes. So looking at some of the economics and social incentives around this topic as well. Todd, you know, you've talked about the government mandating Euro 6 and that sixth generation coming through. What are some of those carrot and stick options that government regulators are looking at around enforcing change?
Yeah, thanks, Eamon. First of all, on online shopping, I think the figures I saw was that we're going to go from about $27 billion spent online in 2020 to $60 billion by 2030. So there's a doubling of online shopping expenditure and more customers every single day, and that's changing the way that consumers consume, but it's also changing the way that freight moves goods. Instead of one vehicle going to a Westfield dropping off a whole truckload of T-shirts, we've now got 50,000 trucks doing deliveries to houses for that convenience factor. So the freight, the mode changes, the type of vehicle changes, and the whole system changes, and we're currently working through that. In terms of how do you carrot and stick, or what the government can and should be doing or could be doing, that's always a dangerous question for me. But look, in Europe, they have increased the stick dramatically, and that hasn't been taken up by this government in Australia yet, or, you know, if at all, no one's talking about it in Canberra. But in Europe, for every gram of CO2 that a heavy vehicle will release into the atmosphere by a certain date, there is a financial penalty to the company. They have moved, the government in Australia has moved to do that to some degree with passenger cars, but hasn't yet done it for commercial vehicles. In terms of the carrot, my belief is that truck operators, truck owners, and I don't represent them, so I always put that caveat out there. I think they're really interested. I think they're really keen to try it, but they're also wrestling with 120 years of the internal combustion engine. Most of the trucking fleet are owned by small mum and dad businesses. So 90% of the fleet is owned by someone that has less than 5 trucks. They've mortgaged their own house to the hilt to buy that. They have under 10 employees. They are not rich oligarchs throwing money around for capital, for new capital. So they hold on to what they've got. And so the average age of the fleet in Australia is the oldest in the Western world. We're at 14.9 years, which is, and there's a reason for that. We don't have an easy third-hand market to hand down our trucks. But in terms of the carrot, what could the government be doing? They could be incentivising either through financial incentives to purchase newer equipment that is more efficient and has a better emissions output, or they could be penalising. So, for example, Euro 4 trucks, you're talking about 20 years ago now. So if you're driving a Euro 4 truck, and you try and register it, why not penalise that person? And then put a financial cost on that, put a price on that, and say, hey, look, you can go buy a vehicle which is X times better for the atmosphere, for the community, for the environment. Why don't you look at upgrading? And all of a sudden, if you do that, you put a price on being a laggard, and then if you use the money or the revenue raised to then incentivise that new purchase, you help that person out on the other side. So there are things that you can do, politically unpopular, and that's why I'm not a politician, but politically unpopular, but good for the environment, good for the community, and good for progress in what is a really important area.
So Catherine, just building on that and some of Todd's points around the investment models, or the owners mortgaging their house and having to balance that with investment within the business. What are you seeing in terms of investment, sort of funding, and those economic incentives as well?
Yeah, in Queensland, in southeast Queensland specifically, we're very lucky that there has been a huge investment in public transport, in things like Brisbane Metro, Cross River Rail, Logan and Gold Coast Faster Rail. We've got the Wave in Sunshine Coast as well. So that's really, really encouraging to see. But when we talk roads, so the the state's transport infrastructure program over the next 4 years, they've set aside over $25 billion for roads infrastructure. Conversely, for active transport, that number's more in the $290 million range. So there's a huge disparity between what the state is investing and putting money towards in terms of active transport. So it'd be great to see that balance shift. In terms of what they are doing for funding active transport, the state has been working with local government to create what's the Principal Cycle Network. And so any state-funded projects on the Principal Cycle Network, they need to deliver cycle infrastructure. And there's grants out there that allow local governments to ask the state for help in funding their local projects that are also on the Principal Cycle Network. Similarly, with walking, there are grants that the state provides to local government to better plan for walking and creating walking network plans. And then there's even grant funding there that's available to actually start implementing the actions that you create when you're making these walking network plans as well.
So those different models coming through, and obviously different projects being funded as well for those different modes of transport. But Santiago, to throw to you around, I think there might be a perception, and interested in your thoughts around that sometimes these projects and public transport investment are for the benefit of just a few people. What are some of your views around that in ensuring broader access?
You bring an excellent point, and I'll start by saying we don't know what we don't know. And as humans, we don't love change, right? And I bring that up because it's important to keep that as context, because when we propose changes, whether that's a financial incentive, whether that's the opening of a factory, the improvement of a vehicle, more frequency, purchasing newer components, updating, we don't love change. As humans, I don't know the psychology. I didn't study that part. I forgot to attend that lecture. But as humans, the psychology of if it isn't broken from our perspective, don't fix it, lives very, very highly within our, society. So going back to the public transport, there is a lot of misconception. For example, when I first started Halo, we approached the government and we said, hey, we want to do this to improve public transport accessibility. So we said to them, hey, let us install this on the vehicles, let's test it out. And in Queensland, we unfortunately, didn't have much success. New South Wales and Victoria, very progressive, but it was one person that said, you know what, let's give it a go. If it doesn't succeed, we learn from it, but if it does succeed, then it's an improvement. And it always comes down to the fact that when we talk about improving something, we tend to look at it from our own lived experience. So what I mean by that is when we talk about purchasing new vehicles, if you talk to somebody within the operators or within the bus companies, they might say, well, that's more cost for retraining, we need to hire new mechanics or retrain them, the cost of selling the older vehicles, the depreciation, yada, yada, yada. If you talk to the government, they're like, well, that's another investment that we don't necessarily need to make. If you talk to somebody within the public media, they might say, well, that money could be used somewhere else. And we keep going down the line of anything has a but, anything has a rebuttal. But if we simplify it and say, well, let's just do it because it is the right thing to do and because it improves our economic outcomes, we then let go of this idea that, I'm afraid of changing things for the sake of changing. And the best example that I ever heard was from a British gentleman who works in advertisement, and he said, if the electric car was first invented and we were all driving electric cars, and somebody said in 10, 20 years ago, somebody said, we invented this new car, it makes noise, it has 1,000 components that move and might break, and you can't top it up at home, you have to go to a petrol station and it smells funny, and actually it makes noise, it's not quiet, and it spews fumes. Everybody would say, well, are you mad? Why would we use that? Why on earth would we go from electric cars to petrol cars? And that's what's happening, right? We want to do the right thing, but we're used to what we're used to. So from my perspective, I think we just need to show in very simple terms that if we improve something, even if it's a change, it benefits everybody, i.e. texting. Texting was invented because of people who are hard of hearing, and nowadays everybody says, don't call me, text me. So look how things go around.
Some great insights there on change and resistance to change, and I do like that anecdote as well around if EVs to ICEs, if we flipped that transition, there'd be a lot of protests around that. So a great way of articulating it. Todd, just looking then at, if we look at that technology and technology change, but also you've already talked about the freight task and online retail driving that. What can you talk about the total task and what's changing there?
So the total task is increasing from about 760 billion tonnes to about 900 between now and 2050, and over the modes of freight. So last is shipping by a country mile. We don't use coastal shipping a lot in this country. Rail is by far the most. It carries the highest percentage of freight in this country by a significant margin, albeit is flatlining between now and 2050. Road is exploding between now and 2050. And air is pretty flat too, so air freight's pretty flat. So that freight task, just in terms of the road freight task, is going from 250 to 400 billion tonne kilometres. Interestingly, I had to try and, that rolls off my tongue, 400 billion tonne kilometres. It's just it's an easy number. So I thought what I would do today is try and equate that back to something that you might be able to appreciate. It's circumnavigating the globe 10 million times, right? So it is a lot. So how do we do that sustainably? If you accept my argument, and not everyone does, but if you accept my argument that freight is always going to be around, and if I'm at a school, I now say, look, point to something that hasn't got a truck, that hasn't come here on a truck or had a truck on its life cycle in this room, and generally speaking, I have a Mars bar for anyone who can point to something, and no one has so far. So that challenge in the Slido is out there. But the reality is that we've got to do that in the most efficient, effective way possible. And it's not just about the front of the vehicle, the truck. It's also about how do you, and Kath said some great stuff earlier about avoid and then shift. So how do you, the cheapest way that you can improve your emissions output is by doing something more efficiently. So we trialled during COVID some really amazing relaxations of the curfews. Try and get trucks off the road during peak hours. Try and get trucks off the road when every other user wants to use the road space. Put them at night, relax the curfews, and if you are in an EV and it's quiet and there's no noise, you'll be able to do that, and no one will be none the wiser. But we've got to try and do the freight task as efficiently, as safely, and as responsibly as we can. And so, all of these things, there's a lot of investment that goes into this, a lot of R&D across the globe. But Australia is a technology taker when it comes to some of this stuff, as opposed to our innovating on our own. So largely there's three things: population increase for the increases of freight. We are a very lucky country. We are a first world consumer-based economy. We're a little island, which means we import a lot. And that's not slowing down, unfortunately, and those changing of behaviours, which is that convenience factor, which for most, and as Santi pointed out at the start, a necessity for some.
Right, a lot of data points there, and 10 million times around the world. That's a big data point. Catherine, around that, so Todd's already talked around some of the drivers and sort of those data points that are showing the total task increase around transports. But from your perspective, how can we use data a lot better to drive that sort of connected, safer transport networks?
Yeah, and look, from a data perspective, the data we have and how we use it varies significantly depending on which transport mode we're talking about. So for roads, there is such a wealth of expertise, of data, of research, of guidelines, of historic traffic data that you can get your hands on. And that's not the case for active transport or public transport. As technology improves and how we use tickets has changed and improved, that's changed that story. But for active transport, we don't have detectors at in every traffic lane or on every footpath that tells us how many people are actually using this infrastructure. But for active transport, it's not just a factor of demand. So when we try to determine how much traffic a particular development is going to generate, we look up, for this type of land use, there's going to be this many cars that are going to want to come here. But for roads, we don't have to question, is there a road network that's going to get us from A to B? Is there a safe way to get there? Is there a way that's going to be consistent in quality to get upon my whole journey from home to school or to work? But for active transport, it's not a factor of just how many people want to go there. It's can you actually walk outside your door and feel confident and capable and feel safe enough and comfortable enough to make that choice to walk all the way there or to ride all the way there? And I don't think that's quite caught on that that's a factor. You need to look at land use when you're designing active transport infrastructure. Are we close to a school? Is there lots of people walking in groups, walking with their families? Is this on a steep hill and you're going to want to put in some rest areas along the way? Is it on a really hot part of Australia and it'd be great to throw some trees down there to make that more convenient? Or are there gaps on the network? Are there unsafe crossings that we want to make safer for people to make the choice and to make that choice easier to use more sustainable modes of transport? And I think with data and with active transport, GIS and spatial analysis is really important to help us plan where we want people to walk and how we want to deliver for people walking and riding. But what's even more important is actually talking to the people who are going to use the infrastructure. It's going to your community and it's asking the questions to understand why they go and use this particular route to walk there, or where they're walking and why they're walking. And so it's really important to design for the people that are actually going to use the infrastructure.
So, Santiago, Catherine just mentioned that often the public transport operators and those networks don't have perfect data, but of the data they do have, what do you find they can use? What are they taking advantage of, or what can they take advantage of to drive better outcomes for communities?
This is a great question because it is a lack of data, but it's also a lack of access to said data. What I mean by that is, I'll use a bus as an example, and we can use a train, we can use a tram, we can use, a bus might have 6 devices that track its location. One might be for the Opal / Mikey / go-kart / payment. The other one might be to make sure that the engine is operational and it's working fine. The other one is to help the driver navigate. The other one might be for the HVAC and the energy consumption of that. They all track the bus. And you might think, isn't that a bit crazy? You have 4, 5, 6 devices that all of them track the bus, but you have to pay different mobile data plans for each device. You have to turn them on individually, or you just have to install them. And where I'm going with this is, when we look at buses in Queensland, for example, would any of you be surprised that drivers have to memorize a bus route? They can't look at a map. They don't have the ability to punch in, hey, I'm going to do route 84 or 100 and blah, and then the computer that looks like a monitor display when you get on will show them that route. They don't have that capability, even though that's the same device that does the go-kart payments and knows exactly where the bus is. So that is a big problem. We're collecting a lot of data in the background from all those devices and from other sources, but that data is going into a digital storage cage, if you will, and it isn't going out. Another example of that is, when I first started Halo, I said to the government, in many places, Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, I said, one of the reasons is because I'm being left behind by buses, so I want to design a system a little bit like Uber, but for public transport, where you could punch in where you want to go, and then when you get to the bus stop or the train station, the driver gets an alert as to where they need to stop, right? Simple, very, very... And publicly, if you ask the government, hey, let's do this, they'll say to you, we don't have enough data that will work. They're telling a driver that somebody who's blind needs to be picked up at the next stop, or somebody who's pushing a pram needs the ramp deployed in advance. But privately, they have studies commissioned by Deloitte or by, again, if you work for Deloitte, I'm not shaming you guys. They have studies commissioned, and they do surveys and they collect data from the vehicles, but that data doesn't make it out into the public domain. And because that data doesn't make it out into the public domain, oftentimes as a result of politics, because it doesn't make them look good, then we as citizens can't make informed decisions as to who we want to run things. And I'm sure that all of us would agree that even if the data doesn't look negative, but if we do something positive with, even if the data looks negative, but if we do something positive with it, we can make a real change. So from our perspective, in terms of public transport, one of the other issues, in addition to data, not having it, is we know what happens when you step onto a vehicle, whether that's a train, whether that's a bus, a tram, whatever, and we know what happens when you step off it, because you tap your card, we know you're sitting in it, and you tap your card, you know you got off. But we don't know what happens with you, how much you're willing to wait before the bus arrives, how much you have to walk to get to that bus stop. So we can't actively say we should put a footbridge here to cross that really big road, or we should move that bus stop, or we should increase the frequency. And all of that data is available. It might not be public, or it's just not collected. So we just need to be more open at saying, hey, it's a harsh reality, but if we improve it for everybody, then and all of us benefit.
Some great points there around that data access question. I do know we're coming up against time as well, and we want to leave some time at the end as well for questions from the audience. But just very quickly around sort of equitable access and this overall topic. Todd, you've talked before around freight and freight productivity. There's some quick comments on the access system and improving productivity as well along that efficiency and effectiveness lens you've talked about.
Yeah, look, it's national freight tasks, trucks across borders, but the decision maker for access is generally locally. So that there is that tension there between, and often a truck can go 90% of the way or 95% of the way, and then has to uncouple, which is unsafe on the side of the road, just to suit local, often politics, but often local communities. So. Yeah, look, it's a really hard thing, and the lack of consistency, the lack of transparency with data is another thing. That we've got plenty of data, but it's not necessarily published in the public domain. Access decisions aren't published. Bridge engineering results aren't published. So that makes it hard to get equity and fairness in the system, because no one actually knows whether you're going to be able to get that access or not. And so what that does is it disincentivises the capital improvement or the capital expenditure to then make that freight task more efficient. So that's what I'd say.
So those political lens on the local action. So Catherine, first and last mile, and sort of in a similar vein around different levels of government and having to resolve the first and last mile issue as well.
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand that when it comes to public transport, walking is actually a part of every single public transport journey. Whether that's walking from your home to your bus stop or walking from the park and ride to the station platform, everyone still needs to be able to get there. And so the first and last mile is incredibly important because it takes that into account. And TransLink's guidance, they recognise this, and their modal hierarchy that prioritises access by walking and access by riding first, with private car use all the way down the bottom, which is great to see. But one of the challenges is that we don't design for people walking up to the train station or the bus station or the bus stop at the parcel of land that the station is located on. It's all the roads and paths you need to take to get to that point. And so there's lots of different road authorities and asset owners that need to all be on the same page, and they all need to be working together to help facilitate that journey for people from the beginning of the journey all the way to the end of the journey.
So Santiago, before we pass to the audience for some questions, so Catherine's talked about, the holistic view of a journey, but also there's, I guess, the holistic parts of the whole transport system. So the operators, the data providers, as you've already touched on as well. What's some of your thinking around how we can bring that all together?
I think that's an excellent thing for us to work on, because it is that, how do you bring people that might have opposing objectives, even though from the outside it's one single one. Most people in the public transport space, whether that's government, whether that's an operator, whether that's a telematics provider who collects that data and tracks the vehicles, whether it's civil, environmental, mechanical, everybody wants to do what's best, right? Everybody wants to improve public transport. We just need to forgo this idea that if I make a mistake or if I take a little bit longer because I want to think about the possibilities, I'm going to be ousted. And that's the biggest fear, right? When, I guess using me as an example, one of the biggest barriers that we have had with getting Halo into public transport, again, many examples, but I'm just using this one, is the fear that what if it doesn't work? Or what if, and I'm not kidding here, what if somebody using a smartphone using Halo trips while getting on a bus? This came from a risk matrix from a government. I wasn't ashamed, don't worry, it's all good. But I was saying, well, whether they use Halo, whether they use Google Maps, you can and cannot trip. I can't help that. But if we are going to the point of we're afraid of looking at change and looking at trying something because it might fail, then might as well stay at home and not do anything. So I think just be mindful that we have made it to the moon, we have made it to Mars, we have made it to Australia all the way in the 1700s, and we didn't do that by saying, geez, I wonder what would happen if I get wet on the transatlantic/Pacific crossing. We made it there because we realized that nothing easy is worth it, and collaboration is possible. We just need to just get rid of this idea of, oh, you know what? No, it's good the way it is. Just let it be. It's fine. It's okay. Even if we're spending $1 billion on NDIS for transport supports for me, or even if we are using 40-year-old trucks, it's fine. It's all good. Don't worry about it. She'll be right, mate. She'll be right.
No, excellent. Thanks for that overview. And I guess your key message is don't hold back. Yes, there are risks, but don't hold back, and let's take things forward around that. So, last few minutes of this panel session, I'd like to throw to the audience for your questions of the panelists as well. Sarah, do you need this? You've got a mic? Okay. And don't hold back. Remember Santiago's words.
Hi, Daniela from Circular. I'm an environmental sustainability consultant. I'm really enjoying the discussion, so thank you so much. Catherine, I feel your pain. I'm also assisting on Brisbane Metro. Data is also the bane of my life when it comes to our projects. My question is, do we try to get that data that's in the private industry and get it into the public domain? Or what can we do to improve that situation? Do we just start having data collection points that are set up for the purpose of public access? Or do we try and actually, get a hold of some of that private data? What can we do about that?
One thing that I can say is that there are avenues to do that. Currently, I think Transport Main Roads uses DSpark data from Optus to help make those decisions, and there has been a lot of change in that space. More and more often you're seeing open source data and local governments having those GIS layers available for everyone to use, but there's definitely improvements we can make in that space.
I feel your pain too. I read a stat that 40% of the trucks running up and down the Pacific motorway are semi-trailers, so single trailers. So when you're talking about moving freight efficiently, if you were to add another trailer on the back of it, you would have a 100% increase in productivity which essentially takes one truck and two off the road, which reduces fuel burn, shares the space for other road users, reduces congestion, improves cost, everything. But no one is sharing that data, and it's very, very hard to convince. The data's there, and it's just held in private companies, and trying to get them to share it for a good public social cause is hard.
No, I think I won't add too much, but I think open source, or it doesn't have to be open source, but just open data is critical. Whatever we can measure, we can act on. And it's not measuring everything, right? Because if we start measuring everything, then we can't do anything about it. But, look at the internet. You can measure upload, download, and many other things. And yes, well, we can still improve the World Wide Web, if you will. It is really good, and you now can basically be anywhere in the world and do a lot because there are standards, the data is there, so we know, okay, we need mobile data here, we need that there. And it's harder for our industry because, yes, the collection of data is much more involved, and it sometimes can be used for benefit in terms of getting contracts and getting things out and about, but open source, man, it's possible. And the standards exist, actually.
My name is Cedric. I am from Retinol and I have a question for you, Todd. So you already mentioned some measures that you use to cut down carbon emissions for the transport industry. But what would be the more potent measure that you can think of to reduce carbon emissions? In the view that freight by road will be more valuable in the next decades.
Thanks, Cedric. Yeah, thanks, Cedric. Look, I think there's certainly 2 or 3 things. As I said, the cheapest for the operator is how you move that freight task more efficiently. So trying to improve that. Essentially, it comes down to fuel burn, which is linked to your emissions. That's actually good for trucking. It's actually good for the operator because the reduction in fuel burn is fuel in a trucking operation is generally if it's not the highest cost, it'll be the second highest cost. And just by the by, if there's any female truck drivers that are burning to have a career in the industry, female truck drivers are 30% better in terms of emissions output of a truck than their male counterparts. Because of the way they use their accelerator. There's there's moving it more efficiently, but then there's investing in new capital equipment. And it doesn't have to be an expensive truck or trailer. Telematics is really important, so route optimization. So making sure that at the start of the day or the start of the journey, you can do a kind of nice optimal route as opposed to going over there and then over there and then over there and then, like double impacts. That's a really important one. There's stuff that you can do in terms of low rolling resistance tyres, but essentially moving to a battery electric vehicle is, or a hydrogen vehicle or an alternative vehicle or a battery swap out vehicle or whatever the technology is that we're going to favour. We're technology agnostic, so we support everything. But it seems to me that battery electric is winning the current race, and the reason for that is the efficiencies of the batteries are getting improving at a rate, exponentially improving at a rate that is outperforming all other technology modes. So I think if you look at improving what you've already got, adding low cost capex, aerodynamic kits, low rolling resistance tyres, making sure you've got telematics so that you're optimising your trip, and then down the track, driver training and hiring more females, and then down the track looking at investing in a new alternatively fuelled vehicle. That's probably the 5 steps that I would go through.
Santi, this is to you. Given that, yes, we have some data, what I'm keen to hear from you is, how do we collect the specific information we need from the groups that need it most?
One of the biggest challenges we have, and I say we as somebody who's working in that space, when approaching groups that we really need data from to be able to make meaningful changes, i.e. somebody with a disability, is what are we doing with that data? And whenever we approach, heck, I'll flip it around. When somebody approaches me and says, hey, listen, I invented this thing that is going to make your life better because you're blind, and I did some research and I realized that we can improve it because, right? Cool. I always wonder, okay, here's another survey that is going to ask me about 10 billion things, or another device that is going to track 10 billion things, but I won't see the results. And that's the biggest thing, right? When we, I guess what we're trying to do, using Halo as an example, is whenever we send out or say to people, hey, we're coming to this area, or we would like your input on this, we provide them context. We say, hey, listen, this is why we're collecting this data. It's going to be used in these bus routes, or actually it's not even going to be used in those bus routes. We're trying to show the government that there is a need for it. So people don't like to be asked for data, or companies don't like to collect data if they don't know why they're doing it, right? And we're complex creatures. Minimizing what and why we collect data doesn't serve anybody, because then we're all just going to say, here's another survey, here's another email, here is another data point, and we won't use it. And that leads on to the worst component of all of this, which is we seem to be, depending on where in the spectrum you are, pro-public transport against public transport, we don't seem to meet in the middle, or pro-tracking against tracking. Pick a subject. We either are for it or against it, but we never say, you know what, your idea is good, I'll give you my idea, and we sort of meet in the middle. That is something we need to work on, because if we can see and if we understand why we're being asked questions, why data is being collected, and if we can see a long-term plan, and if we can see collaboration between those who are building, designing, legislating, then as a community we can be happier, because we know that even if the outcome isn't what we expect, we're trying to do something meaningful. That's, hopefully that is not too philosophical, and that provides some answers.
All about that balance. Well, thank you very much to the panelists today for all your insights around those, the sort of your initial insights, but incentives. We've talked about tech, data, and some very interesting data points from Todd as well, and then all about that equitable access. So can I get a round of applause for Santiago, Catherine, and Todd, our panelists today.
And thank you to our moderator, who did a fantastic job. Well, I told you it was going to be a strange discussion between equity and emissions. It was, very eye-opening as to how they both intersect so much. And thank you to our panelists. We are going to take, now when I say a short break, I really do mean a short break. I have a number of purple shirts out there instructed to make sure that you are back in here at 2:30. If you don't want to go anywhere, then I encourage you to stand up, do some stretching, do some wriggling and make yourself comfortable. I do appreciate those bench seats are not the most comfortable, so do what you need to do. But again, a thank you to my amazing panel, and thank you for saying yes to my very strange LinkedIn request to most of you to come and talk today. So thanks again.